The way we live is dependent on these undersea cables, and now all of a sudden somebody wants to harm them. Some of those countries involved are clearly trying to use this infrastructure to cause harm to other countries. They are officially just merchant vessels, and it's very difficult to establish that they are operating in conjunction, let alone on behalf of a hostile state. They don't want to escalate it to a military conflict, because then we will have a World War III.
From the blowing up of the Nord Stream 1 pipeline in 2022 to a series of recent attacks on power and telecoms cables in the Baltic Sea and off Taiwan, the number of incidents of undersea sabotage is on the rise. To talk about why this is happening and who could be responsible, I'm joined now by Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and the author of an upcoming book called The Undersea War. Elisabeth, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, you've been monitoring these undersea cable incidents. What level of real-world impact have they had so far?
The impact is that people have realized that our modern societies, the way we live, is dependent on these undersea cables. And now all of a sudden somebody wants to harm them. And then there is an actual case of real practical impact. And that's the case of the Matsu Islands, which belong to Taiwan. And a couple of years ago, the two cables connecting them were cut off by two Chinese merchant vessels. The Matsu Islands, as a result, were completely disconnected from the rest of the world. That is an extraordinary case study, and I think something that we desperately hope won't happen to any of us.
You mentioned that this is primarily a psychological mechanism. If these are indeed deliberate acts, as it seems they may be, what concrete signal are the attackers trying to send?
There are two signals, I think. And the first one is that we can harm your societies in non-military ways, because this is a non-military way. It involves merchant vessels that have every right to sail above these cables and pipelines at any time they like. So we have every right we have every opportunity to harm your vital infrastructure using not military means, but just totally ordinary means that are part of daily life in a modern society. And the second one is that we don't care about your reaction, because we have decided that we are going to use these means. So it doesn't work if you try to name and shame us. It doesn't work if you say Russia was behind it, or whatever country you think was behind it. It doesn't work. They are not embarrassed. They are not ashamed. So that limits our opportunities to do anything about it. And we should remember that responding with military means is also not a good idea, because then we might have a war on our hands. So those two signals are really powerful. First of all, showing that they can do it. Second of all, that they don't care if we know that they were behind it.
If up to this point the impact has been fairly minimal on daily life, with of course some exceptions, would you attribute this more to the ability of authorities to conduct efficient repairs, or do you think these attacks aren't that sophisticated yet? And if it's the latter, are they going to get more aggressive?
The reason we haven't seen catastrophic impact so far is that there's a lot of redundancy in undersea cables, and also to a lesser extent in pipelines. So there isn't just one cable connecting a country to other countries. They have lots of cables, and often in pairs. So if one cable is for some reason damaged or cut, then the other cable will pick up that traffic. But that of course depends on that other cable being operational. But that is the reason that there hasn't been enormous catastrophic impact so far. In the case of the Matsu Islands, both of those cables were cut, and because it's a small collection of islands, they only had two cables connecting them to Taiwan proper, and those two cables were cut. And also we should remember, these merchant vessels, they are officially just merchant vessels, the ones we have found to be the likely suspects so far. And it's very difficult to establish that they are operating in conjunction, let alone on behalf of a hostile state. So that state can keep trying ever more brazen or large scale or elaborate attempts to disrupt and to harm, I should say, cables and pipelines.
I want to look specifically at some of the recent attacks we've seen. The cutting of the S-Link 2 power cable between Finland and Estonia just last month, for example. Finnish investigators believe the vessel used is an oil tanker, the Eagle S, part of what they call Russia's shadow fleet. Can you walk me through how they would have come to that conclusion? How does evidence gathering work in cases like this?
What happened then was that the Finns were watching several vessels that they thought might get up to no good, and they were watching the Eagle S, if one can talk about getting lucky, they got lucky because the Eagle S did get up to no good, and it did get up to, in fact, an attack on a cable, and in fact it may have been several cables, but the Finns essentially watched this attack on that cable in real time. And this is why they could be so sure that it was the Eagle S. But usually, so far, the way it has worked is that operators discovered that a pipeline wasn't working properly, or that cables weren't working properly, and they alerted the authorities. The authorities then took a look at it and tried to establish who had been nearby. But that it's different trying to establish, as in any criminal investigation, trying to establish the fact who did it. That's much harder than seeing a crime being perpetrated and essentially arresting the criminal the moment the crime has been committed. And they also got lucky because the vessel then, it was apparently very close to Finnish territorial waters, or just on the edge of Finnish territorial waters, and they then managed to get it into Finnish territorial waters from what we can tell in the public domain, the information that's in the public domain. So that was very fortuitous for the Finns too, because if a vessel is in your territorial waters, you have far more rights than you do if it's in your exclusive economic zone, let alone in international waters. And that's also a difference compared to the other attacks, and they have taken place in the exclusive economic zone, and it makes it much harder for the states to bring those involved to justice, because these are criminal cases, and you have, as a coastal state, you have far fewer rights in your exclusive economic zone than you do in your territorial waters. You can't just sail out to the exclusive economic zone and say, we think you did it. No, you don't have that right.
What about the point that Chinese authorities have been making, which is that incidents like these are actually very common and are usually accidental? Is that in any way credible to you?
There are lots of cases where vessels have harmed undersea cables, but you don't harm 3 undersea cables in one go, or 2 undersea cables and one pipeline within 24 hours, as happened with the Baltic Connector, which was the incident in October 2023. And for example, if you look at the 2 cables connecting the Matsu Islands with Taiwan proper, there have been lots of incidents involving those pipelines, those cables in the past. So Chinese vessels are very well aware of where those cables are. And by the way, the location of undersea cables and pipelines is so widely known and communicated to anybody operating a vessel, precisely because everybody wants to avoid the cables and pipelines being harmed. So to suggest that severe damage to several undersea installations within 24 hours, as we have now seen on a number of occasions, that would somehow be a complete accident is incredibly disingenuous. But the other thing to remember, though, is that for the coastal states are trying to investigate these cases, even if they are lucky enough to, as has happened now in the case of Finland, to be able to detain the vessel and the crew, it's very hard to demonstrate intent on behalf of the captain, the shipmaster, because how can you demonstrate that he wanted to harm the cables?
You've mentioned that the attackers in these cases don't feel any shame. They are not afraid of a potential response. If we look at what has happened, NATO says it'll boost its presence in the Baltic Sea in response to these attacks. Has this happened yet? And how would this look in concrete terms? Are there vessels capable of intercepting ships that look suspicious?
Yeah, so NATO has indeed launched an initiative that involves vessels, NATO vessels sailing around in the Baltic Sea near infrastructure, undersea infrastructure, and there's a lot of it in the Baltic Sea. And that is meant to be a deterrent, because what is not clear is what those vessels will do if they see an act of sabotage taking place. And it's also not clear what would happen if they were to sail up to a vessel that is acting suspiciously and try to encourage it to move away or stop acting suspiciously, because there is the risk that in that case the Russian Navy will send out vessels to escort those merchant vessels, on the basis that every merchant vessel, and indeed every vessel, has the right to sail through any waters. That is the right of innocent passage, and every vessel has that right. So if NATO vessels start sailing up to vessels acting suspiciously, then the Russian Navy could send out vessels to escort those ships, and it would have the right to do so. And then what would happen? I think that would be a very volatile situation, and that would bring the potential for considerable errors or miscommunications, and as a result, direct confrontation between NATO vessels and Russian Navy vessels.
I want to look a little more deeply into who manages undersea cables as well, because if we consider that 97% of the world's internet data travels undersea, the maintenance of this equipment could not really be any more important. How does the public and the private sector work together? And what about these tech companies like Google and Meta and Microsoft and Amazon that run many of these cables?
What's important to remember is that the owners and operators of undersea cables and almost all pipelines as well are private companies, and when it comes to the cables, it's usually a consortium each time, a consortium of companies. So you can have 2 companies all the way up to 10, 11, 12. And this is all almost all done by the private sector. And we didn't realize, I think, when the internet took off and these cables and started being laid, that maybe we should consider this critical national infrastructure that might be government owned, or that should be government owned maybe, and at the very least have some sort of government regulation in terms of, protection and backup. But that's where we are now. We are realizing it now with all this already having been put on the seabed, and it is really paradoxical that something that was built to connect the world's countries is now a source of incredible vulnerability and headache, because some of those countries involved are clearly trying to use this infrastructure to cause harm to other countries.
It really does seem rather scary. And of course, undersea operations aren't the only form of grey zone warfare that we've seen. There have also been cyber attacks, attacks on cargo planes even. Is this simply what we can expect from the new era of warfare?
I think the reason that we are seeing so many subversive acts against various countries, and especially against liberal democracies, Western countries, is that we have reached a point where the world's countries are not getting along anymore. And that point was always going to arrive. It's like children in a sandbox. They can play nicely for a few minutes, and then that ends, and they start fighting. And then at that point, a parent intervenes and says, you have to get along. But among the world's countries, there is no parent who can intervene and say, you have to get along, and I'm going to make sure you get along. There is no authority like that. So the world's nations have to fight it out among themselves. And that is what's happening now. It could happen with military means, but it's happening with non-military means. So with grey zone aggression, in this grey zone between war and peace, simply because if you, as a country that wishes to cause harm to another country, use non-military means, then you can do so pretty much with impunity. But because what is that country going to do to retaliate? It's not going to use military force because it would be too dangerous. And so you can use these tools in the grey zone. You can target infrastructure. You can use disinformation, cyber, weaponization, migration. All these things that we have been seeing in recent years, and the targeted countries, I should say, will really struggle to respond because they don't want to escalate it to military conflict, because then we will have a World War III. And the second reason that this is happening is that, at least as far as NATO is concerned, NATO has been very good at military deterrence, has demonstrated or communicated clearly enough that if you attack a NATO member state using military means, then NATO will punish you. But NATO is not in charge of communicating about what will happen if you target a NATO member state using non-military means. That is not NATO's responsibility. So, of course, if you're a country wishing to harm one or more NATO member states, you will use grey zone aggression.
In your view, should responding to grey zone aggression be part of NATO's responsibility?
People in the public debate, all those hoping and expecting NATO to respond to non-military attacks, I think are too optimistic. NATO is a military alliance. To establish some sort of additional capability, and it wouldn't just be some sort of additional thing NATO could do. It would be a whole, let's say, a clone NATO that would look after grey zone aggression. That is a massive undertaking, and NATO is not the institution that's best placed to do it. The institution that's best placed to do it are within the countries themselves. There isn't a department in charge of grey zone defense in any NATO member state, but they have within their wider governments, I think, the opportunity to build up better defense against grey zone aggression, and also resilience. And that's what we are seeing happen in a lot of NATO member states, ranging from Estonia to other Baltic and Nordic states, to more unusual countries like the Czech Republic. So that is beginning to happen. But to expect NATO to look after this as well, I think, would be to expect miracles and then essentially dilute NATO's focus on military defense and deterrence to the detriment of our security, ultimately.
Elisabeth, I have one final question for you. Most people here in Europe may be vaguely aware that this kind of thing is happening, but not actively worried about it. Should they be?
They should be worried about it. They shouldn't panic, because the moment we panic, we have essentially done the work of our adversaries. They want to cause panic within our societies. And that's what we saw with the colonial pipeline attacks in the United States in May 2021. So a cyber attack on Colonial Pipeline, which is a pipeline that provides a significant percentage of the fuel on the US East Coast. That was a cyber attack, and Colonial had to shut down this pipeline, fine, and that was going to lead to considerable disruption. But when the news came, and it was major news, unsurprisingly, people reacted by saying, oh, there is going to be a shortage of fuel as a result of this suspension of Colonial's operations. I should fill up on petrol in my car. And it seemed like the entire East Coast filled up on petrol in their cars and filled all kinds of other containers as well. And the result was that there was really a massive shortage of fuel. That's not the reaction we should go for. We should be aware of the risks, but we should also know what to do if there is some sort of disruption, because then that makes causing that disruption less attractive for those who want to harm our countries, which is why the Swedish leaflet that everybody's talking about in case of crisis or war, that leaflet is so useful and so worthy of copying, because it gives very matter-of-fact instructions about what to do in anything, in every situation, from internet outage to all the way up to war. And if our citizens know what to do, then we can reduce the harm, and that's what we should go for.
Okay, so prepare for the worst, but keep a calm mind. Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for speaking to us.